So hello, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce you to a very fascinating panel that we have invited to discuss a very, I think, important question, very general but very acute question on the new economic paradigm. I would say some words on that. I would just like to introduce the speakers first and bring them to the table. First, George Akerlof, that probably everyone knows of you, excellent economist, Nobel Prize laureate. Please take your seat. We're having Rob Johnson, president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking in New York. Marcel Fratzscher, also president from the German Institute for Economic Research, DIW. Thank you. Xavier Ragot from Paris, from the Observatoire Français des Conjonctures Économiques. I learned. And Michael Jacobs from London, from the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. Thank you. So what we are planning to do is to have a discussion on what could this new paradigm be, having in mind that for the last, let's say, 30 years, there has been a very strong paradigm guiding the international policies, international organizations, economic policies, which has been very strongly market-oriented, very strongly globalization-oriented. And this seems to have broken in a way since at least the financial crisis. And since there seems to be some vacuum and people don't feel comfortable, what could be that new paradigm? What we want to do on this panel is not talk about the past, not talk about what has gone wrong. I think there are some obvious things like huge inequalities, like the number of what is used to be called the losers of globalization, an incapacity failure to cope with climate change and other things. So it seems as if there has gone a lot of things wrong, and what we want to do in this discussion is to make a reflection on what could be a new paradigm. There are a lot of studies already done on this field, but does this fit into something new? Is there something new emerging which could guide policies, or is it just about having some policies and some correction of old policies? So I would like to ask all of you to give a short introduction on your perspective, and I would like to start with George Akerlof, who has done tremendous work on exactly this, on working on norms, identity, fishing for fools, something you presented at the last Global Economic Symposium, which is all about questioning the idea of the efficient market and questioning homo economicus. So I would like to ask you, is there something, does this fit together, your work, into something new? Is there a new story emerging?
So I think there is a new paradigm in economics. So I think, first of all, we need sort of a microeconomic paradigm about how people work. And then I think we also need a new paradigm for financial markets. So back in the 1990s, Rachel Cranton and I wrote a paper called Economics and Identity. And it said there's a relation between people's identities and their norms. So this paper shows that identities and norms have major implications for all kinds of economic relations. That would include why schools and other institutions work or why they fail. This also includes why there's involuntary unemployment. So in seminars on our papers after we wrote them, we were asked, where do those values come from? And the fact is, we didn't know how to answer that question. But in recent times, just very recently, there's been work that answers this question and that opens up this whole field of identity economics into something that's really quite different. So Jean-Paul Carvalho and Stephen Bosworth, Dennis Snower have very important papers on this topic. So I'm going to talk about another paper on the topic, which I think is within this paradigm. That's a paper called Values and Norm Formation by my son, Robert Akerlof. So I'm going to give you a sketch of it. So when we talk about a paradigm, I feel that where economists work, if you ain't got a model, you ain't got the economics. Somehow you have to have it down in the mathematics. Otherwise, it gets ignored. So I'm going to give you a sketch of it, just a sketch, to illustrate the emergent paradigm. So his basic assumption can be seen in the context of schooling. So a student can choose to value academics or to value rock music. But her choice of values for academics or for rock music depends upon what makes her happy. So how happy she is depends upon her self-esteem on the one hand, what she thinks of herself, or upon her peer esteem, which is what the other people around the table are thinking about her. So her self-esteem depends upon her performance relative to the average performance of what she values of those in her comparison group. That's why I said around the table. So isn't that actually the way the world works? If I value academics, then my self-esteem depends on my performance in academics relative to my associates. It does not depend upon my performance or theirs in rock music. So he has an equilibrium. In the equilibrium, people in the model choose the following. They choose their identities, which is academics or rock music. They choose their norms or values. What's the value they place on academics or on rock music? And they also choose the members of their interaction group. So the model then gives a template for answering the question that eluded Rachel and myself. It answers the question where identities and norms come from. But then it added something more which is also central to sociology. That is, it tells us who will interact with whom and why, and how that will affect the norms and values in turn. So now I'm going to give you some motivation for this. You know, I gave you this abstract model. It's probably very hard for anybody to understand. But I did that. I wanted you to see that there is a model. And so now I'm going to talk about, and I hope that maybe you can just get a glimpse as to why this could answer these questions. The model gives a natural explanation to economists for William Julius Wilson's claim for the role of the exit of manufacturing jobs in the downfall of the US inner city. When manufacturing jobs disappeared, those who could not get the jobs switched from work values to street values. So this model can also be associated with ethnographies. I'll give you another example. Captures exactly the motivations that the protagonists in those ethnographies are ascribing to themselves. So a particularly good example is the behavior of Primo. Who is Primo? Primo is a drug dealer in Harlem in Philip Bourgois' book, In Search of Respect. Now that word, in search of respect, of course, that's what this model's all about. And so that's what it describes. So Primo in this does something that's rather peculiar. He has a rather good job as a mailroom clerk at a desk publishing company. But the people around him have no respect for him, and he really resents it. So what he does is he casts off his work values. He can't deal with this lack of respect that he's getting there. And he switches to street values and becomes a drug dealer. So just to give you the advertisement for the idea that we might really be at the beginning of a new paradigm, this model is then a template for explaining a very large number of concepts such as identity, norms, resistance, legitimacy, reference groups that sociologists emphasize. But these are foreign to economics, and I think when we bring them into economics, we're going to see lots of things that make people more human, and then we're going to get lots of things that we're now seeing in a bigger space. And maybe Rob will talk about some of that.
Thank you, George. Indeed, I would like to ask you, Rob, to give us your perspective, having had these approximately 8 years of existence of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which has been created after the financial crisis. So what has been, in your view, what is the state now compared to the times when the Institute started?
Well, first off, I have to go to confession in listening to George. I came over on an airplane last night, excited to be back in Berlin, and I listened to the U2 record Achtung Baby, which was created here by Brian Eno and U2 in Berlin. So I don't know if it's economics or rock music. I think it's economics and rock music,
Okay.
but I'll have to prove that in a later session. At any rate, the things that I see on the horizon really comes from a historical perspective. I believe that the problems you have with your, your paradigm or ideology are the product of the wounds that you received historically. So the separation of church and state, which was very necessary at one point around the time of the 30 Years' War, leads to a pretend value-free economics. And as George is working back into the notion of values and norms and identity, it's enriching what we say, the kind of things we can explore and explain legitimately. The second, which probably related to the Bolshevik Revolution, was the separation of market and state, where the, failure of the experiments in the Soviet Union led people to want to think about markets as almost a deity, and they stopped thinking about politics. In the United States, where I'm from, we just got one big dose of reawakening about how unresponsive and unrepresentative our political system is and how that relates to economics. Because the regulation and structure of markets, the nature of finance, what we do or don't do on environmental regulation, the tolerance for the narrow concentration of income and wealth, what my colleague Tom Ferguson has named the high income trap, where politics stops being responsive to a broad base of the population and risks social unsustainability. So I think that politics is very important. And George, you spoke also about the notion of financial markets. I think financial markets increasingly now have to understand fundamental or radical uncertainty, the kind of work that Roman Friedman does for INET and his colleagues in Copenhagen, or Rick Bookstaber's new book, or there are many, Dennis Snauer has been enthusiastic about this realm, and the people at UCL, David Tuckett, are exploring this area. But the idea that you don't know the future, you can't pin it down, sort of suggests that we've been running our financial systems around the world on too thin a margin and risking calamity. So I guess I won't go on much further there, but in the context of a market system, I know, Michael, you alluded to this earlier, you have to understand the institutions, you have to understand the politics of design, implementation, enforcement, and you have to have values about what these means, whether it's a corporation or a financial market or a financial institution. These are the means to the ends for society, and we need to reinvigorate that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I think it's a little bit a question about the universality of economics, which has been pretended, with universally given economic laws, and then this seems to be one side of the approach to question this and to go into more divergent or more differentiated.
Just in that regard, the Young Scholars Initiative, which Jay Pocklington, sitting to my left, runs, is very, very vibrant, and it's vibrant all over the world because the young people, they call the millennials, are not buying the old paradigm. They see their problems, and they see our, what you might call, constricted vision, and they're asking for more, and they're asking for curriculum reform, and they're setting up their own study groups and almost becoming self-taught economists because they're not seeing the custodians of the profession giving them the things and the tools they need.
Michael, you've been co-editing the book you have, which I'm proud to show, but some publicity, but it's worth it, on rethinking capitalism, and you collected some big authors like Andrew Haldane and Joe Stiglitz and others. and yourself to question and to see what the new paradigm could be, to question the old one and see what the new one could be. And you did a very fascinating introduction in this book, trying to put these pieces together and to see what could be that new story, that new guiding line for politics. Could you please just give a short version of this?
I shall try. So we've been given 3 minutes, as well as an audience that we have to look round at, unless you want to do everything on the screen, which we could do. We needn't be here at all. We could be in another room and you could just look at the screen. But we are here. The first thing I think it's important to say is that the conditions are ripe now for a paradigm change. There have been 2 significant paradigm changes in economic thinking and economic policy over the last 100 years. In the 1930s, following the great crash of '29 and the Great Depression, it took quite a long time, but a process of political reform and then economic thinking reform, almost entirely embodied in Keynes, they're not entirely, led to a paradigm change. And from the 1940s onwards, expressed in policy, domestic policy, and also international policy, Bretton Woods and so on, the core thinking of economics and the core policies that flowed from it shifted. In the 1970s, after a not quite as dramatic, but nevertheless a set of crises in Western economies, the oil crises, and then the stagflation of the 1970s, simultaneous unemployment and inflation, which appeared not to be explicable by Keynesian economics, a second paradigm change occurred. This was most obviously represented in the US and the UK, where the advent of President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher instituted what was a different system of economic thinking based around freer markets, deregulation, privatization, and so on. We are living now in an economic and political times which appear to indicate a set of similar crises within economic thinking and policy. The failure of a neoliberal or orthodox economic model to, firstly, to regulate the financial system in such a way that it didn't cause systemic crisis. That was a clear failure of a deregulatory model. And now to deal with the aftermath. So the slowest recovery from a recession, from a slump on record, very low productivity, static productivity, rising or static inequality in countries, living standards unchanged in the US, median living standards in the UK, 30 years in the US, a decade in the UK. This is a set of economic crises, both in the theory of economics, which is how we understand the economy, and also in policy making, in being unable to address the problems that we face, which are comparable to those 2 earlier periods. And the question you ask is, do we have a paradigm into which we can now move from the neoliberal free market orthodoxy, which has been dominant for 30 years? We clearly don't in the same way, in that the political reaction to these events has been very diverse. So President Trump in the US, the Brexit vote in the UK, President Macron in France are 3 different political responses to the situation, and their economic policies look as if they're going to be different. So we don't appear to have yet a coalescing around a Keynesian equivalent or a free market equivalent. The interesting question is whether we could be close to it. And I think my view, and the view that I took in this book, Rethinking Capitalism, which I've edited with Mariana Mazzucato, is we are closer to it than we yet know. And part of the problem that we have is that heterodox economics, which is all the people who reject an orthodox approach, are still very heterodox from one another as well as from the orthodoxy. And there are 2 reasons for this, which I think are quite important. One is, if you want to understand modern capitalism, you are inevitably going to have a much more complex set of theories than the rather simplistic ones we are trying to replace. The free market neoliberal system is deliberately very simplistic. It has simplistic models of how economies work and a relatively simplistic set of policy solutions. Actually existing capitalisms, which are not all the same in different countries, are very complex. And so, in a sense, it's not surprising that we're not coalescing around something simple. The second one is, I don't think we've been organized enough. So Keynesianism, luckily, embodied in one man, was very well organized. It was organized in the writings of Keynes. The neoliberal revolution which occurred was also pretty organized. Hayek and Milton Friedman were organized. They had a society, they had think tanks, they had journalists in various parts of the US, the UK, and then more widely, who propagated a certain kind of view. We, on the alternative side of economics and economic policy, have not been as organized, and I think one of the tasks we now need to do is that. Very simply then, because I realize I've taken up the time with all the preface to the remarks, is what is that basis? And I think if you want a simple analogy, I think it's the shift from Newtonian physics to evolutionary biology as the mental model of economic systems. We have in orthodox economics, and in economics which most people get taught, and certainly which is propagated through commentary about economics, in the Academy of Economics, there's a huge variety and diversity of thinking now going on. But in the orthodox view that gets taught to most economic students for most of their time at university in undergraduate and master's courses and is propagated in commentary, a very orthodox model of how markets work, of the firms within markets, and of the role of government. It's markets as competitive equilibria in which there is market failure when things don't go to plan, but interventions by government can then correct market failures. This doesn't in any way now characterize the complexity of actually existing capitalisms in which firms are very complex structures which behave differently in different circumstances with different value systems, with different governance systems, governments which are integral to markets. You can't say governments are intervening in markets as if the markets pre-existed. Governments are integral. Law, regulation, tax, and so on are absolutely integral. And the relationships between them, which are not equilibrating markets. They are evolutionary systems in which innovation, technological change, system change, firm change changes the way in which those relationships occur. And an evolutionary model is a much better way of understanding capitalism. And we now know that it's not just an evolutionary model in the sense of dynamic change on Schumpeterian model, but it's based on an ecological underpinning, which if we don't pay attention to it, if we don't actually understand the ways in which our economy interacts with the natural environment on which it rests, the resources and the assimilation of wastes, we are going to destroy the basis of the economy. So we have we need an evolutionary model of capitalism which understands the institutions that operate in the economy in a much more sophisticated way, and we need to understand its ecological underpinnings. And I think between those, we have the basis for a new economic paradigm, but we will need to get much more organized around it for it to have the kind of impact on our current economic and political circumstances that those two previous paradigm changes had.
Mm-hmm. To put it on the French and very concrete side, there's been a lot of noise and a lot of hope around the election of Emmanuel Macron in France. Is this something of a new paradigm emerging?
There's a high demand coming from France and Germany now to try to put some initiative on the table to make the euro area work again. What should be done, I think, is clearly part of the debate we have. What is a new paradigm? Because I think we have to step back a little bit. I think that there are two ways to think about this new paradigm. The US-based way, I would say, it's about finance and instability of finance. And the European way, it's about European divergence, which is not really about finance. And I think this new paradigm will be a little bit as, for Keynes, a problem-solving paradigm. What should we do to think about making Europe converge again? And this will help to think about a new paradigm. Let me be more concrete. Okay, France and Germany were very close in 2000 on many dimensions. Unemployment, current account, inflation, growth. 15 years later, the two countries are very, very, very different. I only speak about France and Germany because they have to find an agreement, a deal to make things work again. We can compare unemployment rate, we can compare current account, it would be too easy, but I think even more importantly is a public debt, which is so diverging between the two countries. I think this is a key issue to look at as a summary statistics of the imbalances. So the key question is why? How come Europe, with budgetary discipline, monetary discipline, competition on the good market, financial integration, all those type of disciplines that we put on the table make, and we thought that it would create the institutional design, the pressure on institutions to change, to make European converge. It was totally the contrary. The two countries that diverged, France and Germany, have never diverged after the Second World War, except the period after the German reunification. So, increasing market pressure make the two countries diverge in dimension that we do not think about closely enough. What is the key dimension that is not on the table to think about the paradigm? I think it's values, it's politics, but embedded in institutions on the labor market. It's the way the wage formation, the labor market process is different, totally different in France, in Germany, in Spain and Italy. In France, we have an inflationary bias in the wage formation process. There are some conflicts, some strike, and we put a little bit of wage increase, and that inflation will restore the equilibrium of the economy. It's what we did since the Second World War. Germany is a totally different story. The central bank was very tough on inflation, and there's a deflation bias compared to France, or a stabilization bias, if you want. So I think what is on the table is to make Europe survive and converge again, is thinking about institutions on the labor market. And this is happening today. I think the new paradigm, in terms of policy implication, is already spreading out in Europe. Let me be more concrete. Germany has introduced a minimum wage for some internal reason. The UK is speaking about increasing minimum wage. It's not in the euro area, but it's there. There's a report, a 5% report. We speak about introducing a national agency for competition in all countries to discuss about wage dynamics and to make a coordination at the European level. It's not very popular, but there's some starting a new institution to re-institutionalize the labor market in Europe. We speak about, the Bank of Italy speak a lot about European unemployment insurance, mimicking the US one, the federal one with diversity of the state institution. So there are lots of ideas about thinking clearly about the source of the divergence, which is the labor market. And labor market, I will go in your thinking. What we call labor market is the firm. What's going on in the firm? The fairness within the firm, the reference group of the worker within the firm, the values on the workplace. So labor market is a short summary for the workplace within the firm. So, and I think it's the issue to make Europe converge again. So the new paradigm will evolve. I think it will be, to summarize and to conclude, it will be, as at the period of Keynes, problem solving, and the problem, I think, is on the labor market. We have to think about it and create a good model and variety of models to think about that. So academia have to look at how to solve this problem. And it's already there. And the labor market, I think, will be key and values within the firm to think about the deep politics, which is the wage formation process across countries.
Marcel Fratzscher, is there scope for this Franco-German approach to bring different functioning of labor markets or other things together again? Germans are said to be not the most unorthodox in the economic debate internationally. Why is it? I mean, is there scope for something like that?
Really? We are not the most unorthodox? I want to link that into a broader context of the social contract, and I maybe don't agree with everything that Xavier said. Maybe just a short side note is there's actually no divergence between France and Germany. It's just the perception of it. Just to give you one example, since 1999, the French economy grew by 3% more than the German economy. So, we like to forget in Germany that we were the sick man of Europe 10 years ago. And we are now in a process of catching up, not more, not less. And I don't want to belittle the success stories that Germany had. But I want to talk about an issue that relates to a lot what has been said, and that's the role of the social contract. And if you look at Germany, if you look at France, if you look at the United States, there's a feeling by many people that the promise of the social promise has been broken. In the United States, you have 40% of the workers at the bottom of the distribution who have lower real income than in the 1980s. So they feel left behind. They feel disappointed. They feel, look, the promise of the American way, the American dream, that I can really have my own responsibility, can take responsibility for my life, has been broken. you find that in every other European country as well. You find that in Germany. In Germany, we have long been proud of this, what we call the soziale Marktwirtschaft, social market economy. So a balance between a strong welfare state on the one hand and a functioning market economy on the other hand. And that has given rise to everything we have seen, to the election of Donald Trump, to the Brexit decision, to Marine Le Pen winning 11 million votes in the French elections. You see that also in Germany. And I think this contrast between, you know, what are people expecting from or as a social contract and what is a state able to deliver, I think that disappointment is really for me one of the core issues. And a lot of people argue, maybe Michael has been going a bit in that direction, say, you know, markets have been capitalism has been brutal in the sense that it has created winners and losers. We have seen globalization, we have seen technological change, we have seen a fundamental shift in property rights, or however you want to call it, that has really created an inequality within society that really challenges our way of thinking about economics and how to fulfill that social contract. Your question to Germany, we have this promise of the social market economy, so a balance between the social welfare state and a market economy. And what bothers me in this discussion that we're having, that the argument is always, or very often, the markets are functioning too well, so they're creating winners and losers. And my argument is actually, markets are actually functioning less and less well. So in Germany, one of the big reasons in most of Europe for this increasing inequality is a lack of equality of opportunity. So the gap in terms of educational opportunities is becoming wider. So half of everyone's income is determined by two factors: the income of the parents and the education of the parents. So this diverging path is increasing. We have this perceived contradiction between state and the market, and the social market economy says you need actually both. You need to have a strong state with clear rules, but at the same time you need to have enough freedom for companies, for firms, but also for individuals to be able to participate. We see that apparent contradiction between solidarity and sovereignty. That the feeling is, in particular from Germany, the other Europeans, they want our solidarity, but they don't want to take responsibility for their decisions. And I think in most cases, the two are not contradictions, but you need both. And also what Xavier was talking about, how to get Germany and France together, solidarity and sovereignty, but also kind of taking responsibility for one's own policies. I think those belong together. So maybe a final point on that is, I think it's really about making markets function properly. I think this model of a social contract that both has a functioning market economy and a strong social component becomes ever more important in a world that becomes more globalized, where technological change, I think we have seen only the beginning of the impact on our economy and our societies. And I think a final point is we must shift from our analysis of economics within nation states to really the global economy. So I think almost all of our models are really closed economy models. We don't really have that global component very well in there. And sovereignty, national sovereignty has become not entirely meaningless, but it's losing its meaning more and more. And more, if you want to have sovereignty, if you take Germany, if you want to have sovereignty over our economic policy, over trade, gaining sovereignty actually means we have to strengthen Europe. We have to give up national sovereignty and shift that sovereignty either to the European or to the global level, because almost all of the big challenges that we face today are no longer national, but they're really global. So I think this shift of sovereignty, the transfer to international, European, global institutions is for me an absolutely important, crucial element.
George, what I would like to better understand or to know is, based on your work on the importance of identity and norms, what does that mean for globalization? Does this mean that this has to be redefined, that probably we have to check things depending on how people can identify with it, and so perhaps bring back some responsibilities to local levels and others to global levels, depending on how it fits to people?
Okay, so let me go back to what Xavier was saying, that somehow that one of the things that's extremely important here are the local labor markets. So I feel one of the problems in Europe, that at least that I see, is that we have different local labor markets, different by country. And there used to be a good way to solve the problems that arose from that, which was if one country inflated, then it could devalue. And so it was devaluation. But so I feel that the existence of a single currency across most of Europe has unfortunately removed that. And so then we have, I feel, a crisis in a good share of Europe, which is extremely high unemployment rates. Extremely high unemployment rates, especially amongst young people. And that in turn creates a serious identity crisis. That one of the things that one's supposed to do as a young person is to get a job. And yet we see these very high unemployment rates, which are keeping people from getting jobs. Very high unemployment rates, for example, amongst young people in Spain and Greece and Italy and other places. And so I feel that in turn, going back to what Rob was talking about the questions of politics and identity, that this creates a problem of identity. Because if you, as a young person, can't get a job, you have an identity crisis. If you have a parent as a young person who can't get a job, you again have an identity crisis. So that it may be that the unemployment rates may be, for some places, only 10%. But only 10% is not only 10%, it's lots of people you know.
Thank you. Perhaps, Rob, to you, the question on also this identity issue, which has been in the core of the debate in the US and Trump and so on. Does there do we need some new definition of what globalization means and what is done at what level?
I'm quite interested in taking Marcel's comments, mixing them with George's, and seeing all kinds of dilemmas. First of all, you had talked about essentially how do differences in identity relate to values about who should be taken care of and not taken care of. In the United States, the most profound example of what we call otherness in the world is the racial animosity between African Americans and Caucasians. And there is very strong empirical evidence that when you run an austere economy, economic insecurity goes up and it inflames racial animosity. And as we've seen in the United States, we've massively contorted our politics and our political structure around that woundedness related to race. And there are examples in other parts of the world, and obviously the migration crisis that's on the horizon here is very important. The other dimension which in listening to Marcel, I really wanted to bring into this is, I think there's a fundamental dilemma here, which is the domain of the sovereign is smaller than the scope of the market. So if you go big, global governance, you become less sensitive to the local needs and variations. If you go small, you're asking people to control an environment they can't control because forces outside of their reach matter a great deal. So lots of people now, all over the world, are very, very unhappy with governance. At some level, the population, say in a segment of the United States, elects the local government. And then they come and tell you, we're going to deregulate, we're not going to protect your rivers and streams, and we're going to cut your labor protections, otherwise capital will leave. Well, now the people who are the representatives in government may be correct, but they're correct in diminishing the outlook, the expectations, the well-being, and the protection of the people who elected them in order to avoid an even worse outcome. So we have real problems now with the politics of governance, and we have real problems with deciding who's in and who's an other, with the fault lines between in and other being a very combustible part of society.
Rob was talking about environment as one main issue. You've been working a lot on climate. in which respect you see that also the climate debate needs some new framing, or is part of this new economic paradigm?
What I think's been interesting about the climate, and to some extent the wider environmental debate, and we need to go beyond climate. We have multiple environmental crises, and climate has rightly taken up most of the environmental movements, and insofar as it's been adopted by political elites, their understanding and engagement. But we have many more crises to deal with environmentally. The interesting thing I think that's happened in the last 10 years is the acknowledgement that you could deal with the environmental crisis and the climate crisis through investment. And in fact you have to, that the old green idea that you would basically cut consumption, cut output and consumption, which is clearly another way of reducing environmental impact, was not going to work either politically or in fact rapidly enough. That what you need to do to shift an economy out of carbon is to invest in new forms of energy generation, in new forms of transport, in new urban design, and so on. And that therefore, what has now become known as green growth or low carbon growth is a strategy both to reduce your environmental impact, certainly for the next 20 years or so, and to stimulate investment, innovation, technological change, and so on. And that, I think, is a really important part of the new paradigm in terms of policy. The core failure of our capitalist systems right now is their failure to raise the living standards of at least half the population. That has been a combination, arisen for a whole variety of reasons, but it's been partly a lack of demand and austerity policies, which came in much too rapidly after the financial crisis, have sucked demand out of our economies. And you don't need a new paradigm, you need to go back to an older Keynesian paradigm to realize that we need demand in the economy. But that demand cannot be an undifferentiated demand for things that raise environmental problems. So we need governments to direct that demand into the things that solve our social problems, of which climate change, environmental degradation is an enormous one. So one of the ways of stimulating demand is to push the regulatory, the carbon tax agenda towards investment in new forms of energy, transport, and urban living, and so on. And the same is true of the other great challenge we're facing, which is demographic change, in which we've got aging populations, a smaller number of people coming into our labour markets to support a much longer living retired population. Again, we should be driving investment into healthcare, social care, and other forms of looking after people in our economy as a way simultaneously of generating demand and also of generating jobs, as well as solving the social problems. So it seems to me that what we are looking for here in policy terms is a new form of demand drive, but to solve social problems in ways that create jobs and decent incomes for ordinary people. The other reason we've got this stagnation of living standards problem is effectively, workers in labour markets have become weaker and weaker in demanding more wages. So very flexible labour markets have generated very weak positions for organised labour. Many labour markets are now, there is no organised labour in them. There's deeply unorganised labour. There's people who are on 0 hours contracts or short-term contracts where they have no bargaining power whatsoever. They don't even know what hours they're going to work tomorrow. And if you look at the labour share of income, national income, and you look at the profit share, there's been this huge divergence in which, while profits have been rising, labour share has been falling, and the relationship between productivity, which is how much we earn per worker at a macro level, and actual wages, which is what you earn per worker, is completely diverged. So once upon a time, those two things went in parallel, as an economist would tell you they ought, and now they've diverged. So we need to address the demand problem, and we need to address the labour markets problem if we're going to get an economy that both restores decent living standards for the majority of the population and also addresses these huge social and environmental challenges we face. I don't think that's impossible, and I think we are gradually moving towards that direction in policy, but it needs much more than it has now.
I always keep in mind, and that refers to what you said, that the old thinking, or the paradigm which has dominated for a long time, the answer to such reflections has always been that finally the market has to decide, because how can politicians know better? So now it seems there are a lot of things that the market can't do, but where's the new guideline? I mean, that's the fear of having governments doing everything without any sense is there. I mean, and that brings the question, may there be something, even if it's not as simple as the market has always right thing, that could help guide politicians in the next decade or more?
Public debate and forums like this one are very useful for this goal. But let me be more specific about, I think that indeed the state can go too big in some dimension, and so we need a clear governance, public governance. For instance, but there's some good aspect to that. There's some social safety net which are very useful in terms of crisis. Let me be again more specific about that. And it's a part of an answer to the remark. I agree a lot with many things that Marcel has said, but a small distinction there. I was not afraid of Marine Le Pen winning, giving a majority in France. Because in France, our state is very big. Our welfare system is huge. Public spending is 57% of GDP, so one of the biggest in the world, except Finland, I think. But the outcome of that is that inequality did not increase a lot after the crisis. So there were no social anger in France. Lots of political anger, because people wanted President Hollande not to be in charge and so on and so on. But people were not against the state, were not against euro, against the EMU, because they felt that the social contract in France, although unemployment is high, is still working quite well. So there's a problem with the French public spending. It's high. It has to decrease, for sure, but not too fast and not increasing inequality, because the gain of having a low inequality and people feeling respected in terms of social contract, it's a huge public good compared to what happened to the UK and the US. So this aspect we should factor in when we think about the evolution of the state. But the drawback of that is that public debt increased by 30%. And now the difference between France and Germany, I think, is not growth, as you said, is public debt. Just do the counterfactual. If Germany public debt follows the French one since 2010, I cannot imagine what happened to Germany. You are almost close to full employment, growth will be so high. I think it's not growth as the main factor to compare, is really the stock accumulating a divergence, which is public debt. I'm not claiming that we should decrease rapidly public debt. It should be a slow process without any mutualization in debt in Europe, no social transfer between countries. So as is possible. So we should do our job. And one of the main jobs to be done in France, going back to what I was saying, is what we call modestly a labor market reform, which is a huge issue about the state trying to change the way the labor market works to make it compatible with the euro area, with a low inflation world. So, and this is debated, I think it's more the ability of the state to create new institutions compatible with euro area, which is what we call Macron labor market reform, which is at stake, than the being afraid of the big state or a big welfare state. I think it's not the main issue. The main issue is, what is the ability of the state and the social contract in each country, and it has to be done in each country because it's very country specific, to change the institution to make it compatible with well-functioning markets or euro area as a whole, with the same currency, the same interest rate for the whole economy. In France, we are trying to do our job with the labor market. Spain has done a lot of job. Greece has done a crazy job. Italy is the main issue that has to be discussed in Europe. But all countries are trying to create new institutions to make it work. It will take some time. Maybe the size of the state will increase to allow for this transition to be not too socially costly. But I think the condition to make Euro work again.
Master Fratzscher, any idea of a new story to tell, a new paradigm story in some sentences?
Maybe to connect to somewhat what Michael said and also what Xavier said. First of all, I'm always very careful with these paradigms because you mentioned Keynesianism and neoclassical approach, and I find the truth is usually there's truth in each of those theories. And you talked about demand management. I think supply management is equally important. To me, the big challenge I see in Europe, for all the economies, including also for Germany and for France, is actually a lot more on the supply side, in the sense that you have less and less equality of opportunity. You have more and more people who are actually not able to participate or bring in their potential. So in Germany, one of the biggest challenges I see is the decreasing social mobility, or relatively low level, and the decreasing social mobility. So if you're born today in a family where your parents have a low educational attainment, have low income, your odds, your chances of really getting a good education, being able to participate, getting into the labor market in the first place, is actually pretty bad. And we have more and more people who are left behind in that sense, that they don't really have an opportunity to participate in that market. So in that sense, I see we have a lack of a functioning market, and the problem really is not to say we have this pie that we now have to divide and who gets what share, but the challenge should be really how we can increase the size of that pie and how we can increase social participation. So participation, economic, social, political, that's what I see as the main challenge we need to address with any new paradigm or whatever you may want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see there's at least one question from the audience, and we have some minutes left to take ones. We have just to pass the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Jan Zygmuntowski, Instrat Foundation. I'm one of the young global changers. I think one of the main problems with our economic thinking is that we've been for a very long time looking at microeconomics first, how businesses operate, how people think, and not at the macro scale, which is actually different. If you look at the ants, for example, if you follow the path of one ant, it makes no sense what the ant does. But then the entire colony, it all makes sense. So the macro scale is completely different than the micro scale. And that's why I really like the idea of evolutionary approach when you look at the entire ecosystem. And I'd like to ask all of you a question. If we could move from thinking about economy as a businesses and market and private decision, where very narrow groups of people who hold private property and the means of production decide what is produced and how do we share what we produce, into thinking about an economy as a huge ecosystem where we could have, like, for example, democratic planning of production and how we divide the outputs. Like, not only political democracy, but also economic democracy. Thank you.
You can pass on. I think we collect this too.
Thank you. My name is Maya Gupel. I'm from the Wuppertal Institute Berlin's office. I would just like to throw in one more term here, because I found it remarkably absent when we talk about paradigm, and that's growth. What do we mean with growth? Because, I mean, both the Keynesian and the then so-called neoliberal was all about reinvigorating growth. And coming from an ecological point of view, of course, we have all that backlash to say there is not endless growth possible. Then secular stagnation, and we see that financialized capitalism is pushing up asset prices, but is not really delivering on creating the value where it's needed. And then, of course, a digitalization towards zero marginal costs and all that will massively impact both on the opportunities on this participating on the supply side, but also towards the sharing economy and what is going to happen on the demand side. So I think when we really think about what's the question in the room is, what is value and how is who valued for participating in its creation?
Okay, I would suggest we have one question there and perhaps another one there, and then we have to give the opportunity to panelists to answer.
Hi, yes, Stuart Wallace from Lancaster University and previously New Economics Foundation. I'd be interested to know what role the panel thinks the stories we tell ourselves and others tell us about how the economy works, play, or narratives if you want, play in shifting a paradigm.
You have to, so.
Thank you. I was really catching this. Okay, you started the discussion on a new paradigm with values. But if we are talking values, we are talking about humans. We are talking about human being. So does it mean that we should accept that when we are talking that the system is ready for new paradigm, we need to say that we are facing the crisis not of economy, not of the politics, but we observe the crisis of humanity. Is it correct or not?
Okay, we have 1 minute,
Humanity.
30 seconds.
Okay,
So
thank you.
if everyone could just give one short sentence to sum up, to react to one question, or to
I'm happy.
say what. Yeah.
Then I can pick the one I can. They're all very good questions, very challenging. But maybe if I may refer to the question of growth, I think that's absolutely right. I think the big challenge is how to generate growth. I think it's necessary. If you talk about debt, how do we get out of it? If you think about how to generate employment, I think that is a big part. But I think you're absolutely right on the quality of growth. So we are really, really bad in economics measuring growth. And in a way, what growth should measure is satisfaction, happiness, whatever creates value, right? And we know that we are very bad at that, and so we definitely need new concepts of how we actually measure growth. And you talked about environmental sustainability, which is an important element. There is an issue of growth, national happiness, which Bhutan has. They're unfortunately some of the least happy people in the world, so it didn't work for them. But I think to think how we measure growth, how we improve in terms of the accounting, I think that's an important question.
Xavier, shortly.
Yes, I think that among the new paradigm, the environment, the question of growth, of digitalization of the economy, I think we will question growth the way we do it, the pure GDP approach. I think the very notion of growth may disappear. We want progress. Progress is not growth. We can make more progress with less growth. For the environment is obvious. We want change. We want increase in happiness. All those concepts should be decoupled with growth. Economists, we know that we do not maximize growth. No serious economists want to maximize growth. It's not the goal. It's easy to maximize growth. You invest like crazy, you do not consume, but Stalin economy at the beginning. So the goal is not to maximize growth, it's to maximize happiness. And we know that as economists, but it's not well phrased with new concepts that could reach policymakers with the good balance between benefit and cost in terms of happiness, welfare, in terms of strictly growth. For the digital economy, I totally agree with Marcel. I think we are at the very beginning of what's going on. What will happen. The question of the basic income that we had not addressed, but it was related to my talk and focused on the labor market. I think it's on the table. I think it's not totally a good solution. I think there's too much decoupling between the social value of the labor process and income. I think there will be a connection between the two in terms of fairness and self-esteem. But still we need some redistribution because indeed some actors are capturing growth and value as an impressive unequal scale, and if we look at the digital economy. So we need some redistribution, but not go at the point of basic income to decouple labor and income. I think it would not be a good solution. And for the crisis of humanity, of course, I let it to my neighbor.
Sure. Go around. I'll come back at the end.
Okay, so I think one of the things that we should be thinking about that I mentioned in the very beginning is the concept of resistance. I think that what is resistance? And resistance is in some sense taking a negative view toward things. So a wonderful book is by Arlie Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land. And everybody here might want to read this because it's about group of people that she interviews in Louisiana over a period of 5 years who put up resistance. And so I suggest that for people in the audience, you may want to put that into your, where it's something you want to put into your analysis.
Mm-hmm. Last word, Michael?
I wanted to pick up on Stuart's question about the stories we tell us, because we are living in a time of political crisis. I think all of us feel that. It's different in different countries, and that's an important thing to recognize. And in order to get out of it, we need to be telling a story about how the world could be different from the one we're living in and how we got here. And for there to be a sense of hope, that a different kind of organization of the economy is possible, and it is possible. This economy is human-made. It's made through social and political forces which we can change. And we will change it through politics, and we will change it through politics, through social organization, political organization, and the ways in which we tell ourselves that we want to live. And what strikes me that we need more than anything now is a vision of a different economy, a vision of an economy which benefits most of its citizens in the way that our current economy is not, in a way which looks after the natural environment, which is the underpinning of our societies, and in which we can have a sense of controlling our own destiny, which I think the process of globalization have left many people feeling that we're not in control. And so creating a vision of an economy that is different, that produces those kinds of outcomes, seems to me to be really important. And if we can do that by mobilizing in this kind of way, then I think we have the opportunity to change the world politically and economically. And in the end, it isn't enough just to have good theories about the world. As somebody once said, the point is to change it.
Many thanks. Last word.
Yeah. You asked me what's changed in the 8 years since I started INET. And the first time I spoke in public was at the Southern Economic Association. And a guy in the back, who I now know was a Hayekian scholar, screamed out at me, "Mr. Johnson, when will you know your work is done?" And what I said to him is, when economics is irreversibly, completely fused with the humanities. Because when the humanities dictate your preferences, when they inoculate you from bad narratives, when they remind you of who's left out, when they question your otherness and your hostility and your fear, it's the best hope that we have. And I think economics has been too abstract. I think economics has enabled cruelty. And yes, I think it's a crisis of humanity, but it's one that can be overcome.
Many thanks. Just one last sentence. I think you referred to former paradigm shifts, and I think it's interesting to look at what happened and how long that took. And perhaps indeed, compared to that, we are perhaps far nearer to something new. And if I listen to all the ideas you have in mind, I'm quite convinced that we are. So many thanks, and let's continue the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
Enjoy your meal from the
I
United
will not be.
States.
Lek ak jamu from Senegal.
Buen provecho from Argentina.
आप अपने खाने का आनंद लीजिए from India.
Maikana from Fiji. Mirurung Ganji from Benin.
Nikmati hidangan Anda from Malaysia.
Buen provecho desde España.
Disfruta de tu comida desde Colombia.